Right, welcome everybody to the Future of Identity series. My name is James Monaghan. I'm a venture builder and freelance consultant in the digital identity space. And today we are discussing identity ecosystems, what they are, why they're important, and what role they play in the future of identity. I'm joined by 5 incredible panelists, so I'm certain we're going to have a fascinating conversation. We have Dominic Barron, who's the co-founder and CEO of walt.id. For those who don't know, walt.id is a provider of open source decentralized identity and wallet solutions. They're used by developers, governments, and businesses across many different industries. We also have Elena Kaduri. She's the co-founder and COO of Doc Labs, which is a SaaS platform for issuing and managing verifiable credentials. We have Otto Mora. Otto is the America Tech Sales Lead for Polygon ID, and he works with clients who are interested in both Web 2 and Web 3 flavors of decentralized ID. Ethan Bernstein, one of the co-founders of the Velocity Network Foundation and its head of ecosystem. In that role, he's responsible for the team that brings new organizations into the Velocity community and enables them to become active players in the ecosystem. So I'm sure he's going to have a lot to add. And we have Daniel Dessau, who is the convener of the European Self-Sovereign Identity Framework within the European Blockchain Partnership. He's also the initiator and project leader of the national Belgian SSI project and is working as a project manager in digital transformation at HowWest. So first of all, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all so much for joining us. As I mentioned at the outset, we're here to discuss identity ecosystems. We all know digital identity is a hot topic, and it's really no surprise because we're living more and more of our lives online and constantly creating accounts and transacting through digital representations of identities. But after we go to the trouble of personalizing these accounts and proving our trustworthiness, none of us wants to go and show up at a new app or service and have to start again from scratch. And that's why portable identities are such a hot topic. But by themselves, they are not much use. And so the shift from silos to ecosystems is what is really underscoring this moment in time that we have. And so I don't want to be doing much more of the talking in this discussion. I really want to hear from all of you. So Dom, if we start with you, there was a great blog post on the walt.id website a couple of months back called The Rise of Identity Ecosystems. If we kick off our discussion today with a quick definition of what you mean when you talk about identity ecosystems, I think that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So what we discovered was this fundamental shift that's happening in the digital world. And this shift can be summarized as identity data moving from applications to users. And what we mean by this is that, traditionally we have our identity data locked into databases by different applications and service providers being fragmented and disconnected. However, from this old world, we're moving to this new wallet-centric world where everybody can seamlessly, share and manage their own identity with all kinds of applications from their wallets. And so when we talk about the rise of identity ecosystems and this movement, this paradigm shift from silos to ecosystems, really mean that we can move away from this traditional app-centric world to a world where within with our wallets we connect with other services within different identity ecosystems. And pretty sure someone will pick up identity ecosystems and define that a little bit more.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what do we think is new about that compared to solutions that we've had in the past? Because I've been able to sign in with Google or with Apple for a number of years now. And is there an argument that those two are identity ecosystems? And if so, what's the particular flavor that we're talking about today?
Sure. So I would say that is a type of ecosystem. So but what we're really looking at today is decentralized ecosystems. So when you sign on with Google, Google is right at the middle of that, and all your data is flowing through Google. Same thing if you're logging in with Facebook or Apple or whoever it is. And what we're talking about today is taking that kind of center of control and giving it to the user. So the individual has the data. It's not with Google's data servers or whoever is helping with that sign-on functionality. It lives with the user in a form of, that CABME shared that can be verified. And it's up to them to be able to provide it to these platforms and to know exactly who's accessing their data and which part of their data they're getting access to.
No, maybe if I can add to that, indeed, so we are switching to an ecosystem because it's not only about, okay, user empowering it, it's also because the world is getting more and more complex. You see that the current user has more complex digital interaction than it used to be. I come from a government perspective, and we had to have normally the gov applications, and you do everything in that gov aspect. Now the interaction is more difficult. You use data from different silos, and you expect also to do those kind of things. People are getting more mobile, so you expect that your Polish data can be used in a complete other context. So the solutions of yesterday are not useful for those kind of contexts. We need to have, it's also about creating new solution because the old ones don't work. And that's a big, Dominica already mentioned, it's a big shift and there's a very fundamental shift. So everybody, every organization, we still used to think, well, okay, we're going to build our perfect solution, even Google and Facebook, but even they need to realize, no, this is more complex, so we need to interact with multiple aspects. So that is a very big paradigm shift in the government, what I know, and the public services, but I think also in the private sector. So user things, things are changing in that aspect, fundamentally.
Yeah, and to build off of what Daniel is saying, I think it's like the first time we're seeing governments finally embracing self-sovereign identity and verifiable credentials and all these standards where they hadn't as before. And so like there's this opportunity to have these public ecosystems where governments are issuing credentials, but also the private ones, and then the interplay between all of these, right? So like it's finally governments realizing that they need to embrace SSI. You know, we've seen it in Europe, we've seen it in Argentina with Cork ID and so on. So it's an interesting time to be, I think.
And it sounds like we're talking about ecosystems, plural here, interplaying with each other in a way that, you know, we've gone quickly from the idea of one single ecosystem, like say the one that a traditional Web 2 hub might have been building. You know, in this talk of public sector, private sector use cases, all these things are expected to work together in some way. Is that right? Yeah. And so, you know, Ethan, you've worked with a number of teams who have built ecosystems as part of the infrastructure that Velocity provides. I mean, can you give some real world examples of that to kind of bring it to life for us?
So building on what Otto said, and to answer, James, what you were asking is, you know, Velocity deals with the world of employment, from education through lifelong learning through employment. And that, of course, is by definition a very complex world of different types of information, credentials, data, education, employment history, skills. And so by definition, no single government, no single employer, no single training institution can, you know, makes up the world that an individual wants to hold and support in terms of who they are from a professional perspective, what they know, where they've worked, what they've done. And as people are much more mobile globally, as people develop skills throughout their life, they need to constantly be able to create and enhance their identity, who they are, what they know, what they've done, what they can do, what they want to do, becomes more and more complex. And of course, you need an incredibly complex ecosystem to do that, because you need basic identity, government, who am I? But sometimes if you're a truck driver, your driver's license is part of your professional identity. Some countries' education is very centralized and governments deal with it. In many others, much of the education is private. Most employers in most places in the world are creating data that's very siloed within their space. And while everyone in the world is looking at skill-based economy and documenting information about individuals' skills and competencies and credentials, all that is held within the thousands of silos in each organization. And people are moving much faster and gigging across gig platforms and so on. The only way to create an environment where an individual can possibly consolidate all that information about themselves in one wallet is by creating a collaborative ecosystem that goes across government, industry, nonprofits, anyone creating data on individuals throughout their employment and education.
Dom, you used a phrase, bring your own identity in your blog, and I've heard that used elsewhere. I mean, it feels like that's really getting to the core of what Ethan's saying there, right? This is about inverting the model in a way. Do you agree?
Oh yeah, 100%. At the end of the day, what we want is to give people control over their data, right? To be able to access any type of product and service seamlessly by just providing the identity proofs that the service or product provider needs. And I think something very interesting that is a direct result of, people trying to access products and services across industries is something that Ethan mentioned, and that is that we are looking into a future where we are having ecosystems that are very different from each other. There will be public, or there are public sector ecosystems for things like your core identity and high level of assurance credentials, something that Ethan is mentioning and that Daniel is heavily involved in. But we also see private sector ecosystems that, sometimes focus on the needs of a specific vertical, like Velocity is doing, for example, or, a specific region maybe. At the end of the day, an ecosystem is nothing more than really a framework that defines the rules of the game, who can trust who and how can trust be established. And there's technical means of doing it, there's legal means of doing it, there's policy means of doing it. But if we're looking at the diverse use cases and the diverse needs that people have, it's quite certain that we're looking into a multi-ecosystem future that is very colorful, very diverse, and just should be focused pragmatically on enabling people to get what they need, get what they want quickly.
Mm. No, that's. I mean, it sounds amazing. I think we need to speak to how this will feel to individuals and to businesses, frankly, when we achieve this goal, right? I mean, Elena, what do you think will be different about how businesses might interact with their consumers, in this multi-ecosystem, decentralized future versus how things are working now?
Yeah, I think a lot of businesses can be hesitant when they first hear about this technology because they're so used to thinking of data as part of, one of their assets almost, or something that gives them a competitive advantage. And so there's a shift that needs to happen there. But once I think they start kind of understanding the benefits that they could receive and also the liabilities that are removed when you don't need to manage so much data, when you don't have the risk associated with kind of data that can't be verified, that might be fake, then there is a shift that can happen. And so I think I like to think about, the improvements that can be made and then kind of the new benefits that could be added onto that. So I think for organizations, things like improving efficiency. So being able to instantly know that a piece of data that somebody brings to you is accurate, the source of it immediately. Like even that in itself, I think is a massive kind of business process improvement. Things like security around how data is shared, being able to provide individuals, users, customers with a lot more privacy and being able to align interests a lot better from that perspective. I think are all really great benefits that businesses, so many different types of businesses as well, can benefit. And then I think it gets really interesting when you start thinking about the new types of business models and new opportunities that this could bring organizations as well. So being able to add to like existing product streams where you might have a really interesting way to add more value to what you're already providing customers to change the relationship a little bit, where maybe a user is using your platform for one purpose, but here by issuing a credential to them, giving them a proof of like what they've done on it, that just increases the value that they're getting from it. And then I think there's also really interesting things when you get into being able to pay issuers and creators of the credentials that can be issued within an ecosystem, and being able to be compensated for that by a third-party organization that you don't necessarily need to have an existing business relationship, but there's enough trust within the whole ecosystem to be able to have a revenue stream there. So I think those multitude of really interesting directions that organizations can take this.
And maybe to add here, what Elena is describing is really the final result, and it also implicates that as an end user, we won't really realize if we cross the boundaries of one ecosystem or another, right? At the end of the day, this should all be abstracted. It should not be necessary for me to understand or know that I'm now interacting with, Europe's more centralized traditional eID system or a more decentralized reputation system based on maybe permissionless blockchains. So all of this should be just not, just happen in the background, including also the new revenue models that are sometimes directly tied into the trust and governance framework of an ecosystem.
Yeah, because maybe to jump to that, what Elina has mentioned, and also Dominique, of course, there are a lot of benefits, and people are seeing that, and new companies are doing this. But if you look at how the current companies are doing that, is of course a very big break towards a current data model. We have a data model of a business model where gathering a lot of data, following that data exploitation to say something is the core. You need to switch into another model that will not go by overnight, and some companies will not embrace that, to say so. So I don't think that it will go magically and everybody will be convinced, because some people are still convinced that you need to gather as much data in a legal or even illegal way. So I think legislation is also needed to say, okay, if we really believe that we need to protect the citizens, then we should do more about the data protection. And we should also enforce that, okay, the things that you were doing until now, following people, gathering information without any consent, we need to break those kind of things, and then the models will not be able. If not, you will be competing as, I think, decentralized solution to something very difficult. That you require wallets, you require consent, and other people are gathering that for free. So that is not an equal battle. So I think as governments, we need to have also a fair economy, a fair data economy, and not based on people that are just robbing data, to say so, and other people are following the rules. That will not work. So the Wild West on data, you should regulate, call the sheriff, to say so, to get some peace. If not, it will be difficult. And I think also governments can play an important role in that. But of course, they are also tempted by the data exploitation. And let's be honest on this.
No, I'm sure you're right, and it would be great if there was data that said that individuals would choose a more private solution given a choice, or but as you mentioned, there's so many hurdles to doing that, like the wallets and consent and so forth, that actually time after time we see that in most cases people opt with convenience. And so there's that carrot and stick, isn't there? There's the delightful new experiences that we can enable, but there's also the consequences for businesses who flout these rules. And perhaps we are seeing the tide shifting there. Also the Polygon team. Oh, I beg your pardon, Ethan. Go ahead.
No, I'd like to give a great example. I think that there are emerging examples where the value is so significant that it creates even an interest for most of the participants. There's always going to be bad participants, but for most of the participants to drive adoption. And I think one of the best examples we're seeing is in healthcare in the United States. And this is probably true in healthcare and a lot of other areas. The pain of today verifying a nurse could take 3 to 4 weeks on onboarding a nurse. A doctor could take 3 to 4 months. And that's because the information that the employer hiring a new healthcare professional due to regulatory requirements needs to go through in verifying all their past employment, all their licenses and certificates, their education, means reaching out to multiple different organizations. The data is so dispersed, often around the world. A Philippine-trained nurse that moves to the United States, it could take her 3 or 4 or 5 months to get the information verified. And as a result, everyone's suffering. The patients are suffering. The hospitals are suffering. There's an incredible demand for professionals in healthcare. And the friction is so high that the individuals who are available to work and want to work can't start. The employers can't start having them on the floor. And in the end, the patients and their families are getting impacted. And so the interest in everyone in that ecosystem that we're seeing, wanting to give the individuals access and control of all these credentials that they've collected throughout their history so that they can deliver them all in a trusted digital format, verify them digitally within a second, and start working in hours or days and not weeks and months, is incredibly valuable for almost all the participants in such an ecosystem. And that's why we're seeing so much interest in moving forward, despite plenty of complexities and regulatory difficulties and so on. The pain is so big that everyone's looking to make changes that will drive SSI and digital credentialing.
Yeah, so it truly is a better mousetrap in that example, right? It's a practical benefit, not an ideological benefit. Yeah, no, that makes sense. The question I was going to ask Otto, I think, builds nicely off this actually, which is, Polygon obviously works a lot with teams in the Web3 space as well as Web2, and I'm wondering if you see some more of that ideological incentive cropping up in your Web3 work, or actually if there's some commonalities there? Maybe you could speak to that.
I think, yeah, so individuals in Web3 are very like privacy conscious. You see a lot of people having anonymous Twitter accounts and caring very much about keeping their identity private and so on. So I think there's like a sort of consciousness of this. There's also like more, let's say, technological savviness around this Web3 population. So like things such as like managing your own keys, keeping your data private and so on is something they very much care about. Probably less so in individuals in Web2 where they're maybe not as heavily focused on that. But then also, as Dominic was saying, I think so the magic here in order to get to have users in Web2 start adopting some of this technology is the wallet experience, right? So the wallet needs to be like this Swiss Army knife that can talk to several identity ecosystems and be able to like make that experience very seamless, right? In Web3, like we're already, I guess, sort of used to the fact of having multiple ecosystems and the fact that we have multiple blockchains, right? So that's like a common thing to us, but it is also translates over to the identity space, right? Where you're going to have multiple identity protocols and wallets need to be that kind of, vehicle that can traverse all of these worlds in a seamless way.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think that's quite a good segue actually from what are ecosystems in general into perhaps what is inside of an ecosystem. You pop the lid off one of these things. What do you actually need to make it work? And so, we've talked a little bit about the need for legislation, perhaps in some case, or at least regulations, maybe standards, maybe wallet things like that. I'm very interested in going around the houses here and just hear what people think the essential ingredients are. I mean, Eaton Velocity has more or less a playbook, right, for building these things together. What do you look at, sort of the core pillars that you need to have for an ecosystem to get off the ground?
Right. So one of our challenges is that our members and the organizations that are engaged in Velocity are not Web3 driven organizations. They didn't come from this. Most of them are actually very afraid of Web3. They're very traditional organizations, whether from an HR tech side, whether from a education side. Education is very traditional, very careful about change. Right, so none of them are going about this from a technology perspective or because of the philosophy, but more of practical uses. So one of the key elements of the way we've approached this is to try to make the technology as simple to use and integrate as possible. These are not organizations that feel comfortable using open source technology, so you need to build things very much productized. Right? They don't want, using even the word blockchain often scares some of these organizations. So yes, we use blockchain and we believe the blockchain can provide self-sovereign, that can be the basis for self-sovereign identity. But we don't need to emphasize those, but really how to simply integrate solutions, SaaS solutions, or readily available solutions into existing systems. So the integration needs to be very simple. It needs to hide a lot of the technology protocols and new things that people don't understand or complex. So that was a very critical aspect of this. The other is to focus very much on real life use cases. As I mentioned, in healthcare, all of the activities we have are practical use cases with real pains, the ones that our members are trying to address. So not coming from this is cool, here's new technology, or here's a philosophy around self-sovereignty and privacy, but here's a pain that you have in your industry, and how could this new approach to addressing that pain solve it in better ways than a mousetrap that exists today. A really critical aspect, Alina related to earlier, is incentives. When we started the Velocity Network Foundation, many of the organizations who joined us said, guys, this is really great. It's great for humanity. People should own their career information. But why would we invest and build things if we're not going to make more money, right? In the end, most of our members are for-profit businesses. And so underlying the Velocity Network already is an incentive system, as Alina related to earlier, that enables any organization investing in this to actually build profitable business models on top of it. And I won't get into exactly how it works in this short time we have, but that was very important because organizations are driven by their financial results, and they want to have a real financial incentive to do that. So I think those are all things that very much focused on what are our needs of our constituents, what are they trying to solve, and how do we deliver the participation in this ecosystem in a way that they can relate to in a current language and not try to bring them into a world that many of them feel actually very uncomfortable with, but bring this new world into a context that they feel comfortable with.
Yeah.
I mean, I
Looked like
think
Daniel was coming off mute. Yeah, good.
Oh,
Sorry,
go,
ahead.
Daniel.
I know. I just want to add to what Ethan is saying, what is indeed rightfully said, that how you can stimulate that ecosystem. One of the things why I entered in this aspect from public sector and EPSI is that we also believe that, okay, we wanted to give as public service the data back to the citizens. And what kind of best way? We didn't want to give that to Apple, to Google, or to anyone. You say, okay, this is the data of the citizen, but we needed a new platform. So I think it's also one of the maybe incentive to create that ecosystem is that the public sector actively stimulates or actually invest in this kind of thing and creates a framework that it can be used by multiple solutions. Because in our philosophy, it will also is the case, we need to be neutral, we need to be respecting what is happening in the market, of course regulated at a certain point, but the user is up to his choice, what he does with the banking, his choice, but it needs to be open and transparent for everybody to use those kind of things. And then, because at the end, issuers make costs to issue credentials, but if we have a system to rapidly issue all the government credentials to the right person, to the user, then he can use it and maybe can stimulate a lot of use cases in those kind of things. The example that Ethan gave was a very interesting example. But if the Philippine government or the Philippine universities are motivated to give those credentials, then you can start and then you can build on the ecosystem and think maybe those kind of things. And of course, government expect at a certain moment bank credentials or commercial credentials can also enter in their processes, but they need to stimulate those kind of things. So government stimulation, maybe very European in that sense, is I think something that could also help the market in that aspect.
So, I mean, you saw Ethan and Daniel talk about basically the same things, right? Ecosystems somehow consist of technology like blockchains, as mentioned by Ethan, and they can be used to have all kinds of functionality built right into, let's say, the backbone of the ecosystem. But they also consist of policy or as Ethan said, incentives, right? And this also explains why governments may, opt to have a model where there's no monetization directly built into the issuance and the verification. At the end of the day, governments are funded via taxpayer money anyways, right? Versus for businesses, such as in different industries and verticals like employment, HR, or education or whatnot, it may very well be necessary to incentivize people in order to get them to become an issuer and basically build up the supply side of the ecosystem. And that also shows you or is a very nice example that illustrates why we will have different ecosystems moving forward, simply because different incentive structures are needed. And the same goes to maybe the third point, which is related to policy, but a bit different, which is regulations, right? Regulations at the end of the day are a form of incentive creation, and policies, although a very special form. And they are another way of basically pushing ecosystem adoption, as Daniel mentioned before. So I think this is a very, very useful way of thinking about ecosystems as technologies and incentives.
And I think another thing, like sort of Daniel was going into, which I think is great, like, there's this shift from the government kind of controlling the identity scheme and like the protocol to like the government being a user of the identity protocol, right? This very much reminds me of what like Diego Fernandez from Argentina, from Quark ID promotes. It's like he's in the government, but he realizes the government is just an additional user in the SSI ecosystem, right? So they don't need to be controlling the identity, but just being a kind of pushing the adoption of this, making people aware of the need for them to control their identity and so on. Two elements I think that are important, at least from our side, from what we see in Polygon ID, to like facilitate adoption. beyond the incentives is like the ease of use, as was being said. I think things such as account abstraction will like really facilitate adoption of SSI, and it's going to be a vital piece of kind of hiding away all of these complexities of key management and so on for the user. And then thirdly, it's like format standards, right? I think it's like also important to focus on that as well, to like get real world adoption. And along with that is also like, where do you store these credentials, right? Like the user is not going to be smart enough to keep all of their data secure at all times, and how do you deal with things such as like the loss of a device where the credentials are stored and so on. So like the data vault, kind of the definition of a data vault and where the credentials can be stored is also, I think, a vital kind of hurdle to overcome to get more adoption.
And this is part of what government can help with, I would guess, and maybe Daniel, you can speak to this a bit, is, if this was left entirely to the private sector, you could imagine perhaps optimizing like just for the core business case that they cared about, and perhaps not making something that addressed every citizen and addressed all the negative cases and things like that. But government can do two of the things you were just speaking about. One is they can provide not just the data for some of these credentials, but also be a consumer of it and therefore drive adoption that way. But also they can require accessibility, and they can require that providers who want to be part of this scheme can will have to deal with negative outcomes like needing to recover a wallet and things like that. Is that a big part that you're seeing over there in the EU, Daniel, about sort of the way government is looking at these things?
I think it's indeed a big part, but it's also a very difficult exercise, because what I see in Europe is that governments still think, okay, we need to provide that wallet, we need to keep all the rules very into control, and nobody accesses our network without we consent in this kind of thing. So you get some centralized, decentralized approach, but a very controlled aspect. Some other countries are advanced and say, okay, no, that is not the approach that we want to do. We want to trust our citizens, have an open market, of course, regulated, protected, but not to do this kind of. So you have a lot of discussion about those kind of models. You talk about Web 2 and Web 3. We are not out that we are already in the Web 3. We are in that hybrid phase where some days you say, okay, people are looking at decentralized aspect, and then coming back, they say, okay, they call it SSI, but it seems to be that it's really strictly controlled. So you have constantly those kind of fighting aspect. But I think at the heart, and if you look at the political message that Europe is giving, it's about empowerment of citizens. It's about giving their real control and democratic thing. It's not about that old model or that state control. So I think even people that are struggling to go into a new model will need to adapt. We'll be having a hybrid phase, but at the end it will come to the other aspect. So governments are still struggling with that new role and how to see that, because I think the essential aspect what Otto is mentioning, who is indeed providing that wallet, is something also difficult. Is it startups? Is it banks? Is it government? It should be something, because at the end it is something, it's like your money. Okay, some people will say you have the crypto and no problem with that. But at the end, it's a financial instrument that also need to be protected, and you need something that is also that you can trust, that you don't have a wallet and the other day you have complete loss in that aspect. So it is a difficult situation, and people are struggling to find a good balance on that in Europe, but also in the world aspect.
Yeah, no, I think we definitely observed that, and Elena, I know that usability is one of the things that Doc has really focused on. How do you think about that balance of hiding the working in some ways to make this accessible for users, but also needing that trust and transparency that we've just heard from three of your fellow panelists saying is absolutely critical to get this open ecosystem to thrive. I mean, when you approach those trade-offs, how have you thought about that?
Yeah, I agree with what's been said, where I think we need to make it as frictionless as possible for individuals. We know that there is a shift that, individuals need to make, and making that as easy, like they don't need to know, that a verifiable credential, for example, is working in the background. I think from their perspective, make it, as easy as scanning QR codes or opening something on your phone. And then I think for organizations to implement this, I agree with what Eitan said as well. Providing tooling that is familiar, that is easy to use, is extremely critical. organizations don't want to touch cryptocurrency. They don't want that anywhere near their bookkeeping or anything like that. And they also don't necessarily have blockchain developers. They don't they don't want to learn a bunch of standards. So I think making this really familiar and easy for them to adopt is really important. And I also think helping them kind of understand where to start with this, because it is a lot to take in for an organization, especially a large organization. And finding kind of one small use case to start is a really good place. And what we're seeing as well is a lot of organizations who are starting to adopt this look for internal use cases to begin with, to get started, because I think the ecosystems we're describing can be massive one day. It could be governments and banks and startups and all kinds of organizations. But I think to start, a lot of what we've seen work well is kind of organizations taking either an internal use case, maybe it's verifying their own employees internally, or maybe they have one other organization that they're partnered with, and they together they start something and build that out. And then I think that can really seed how this could work, and then from there, that's when you can kind of start making it bigger and bigger and start adding in the scale of the credentials that are being used, adding in other organizations that want to trust this as well. But I do think adoption moves slowly, and so helping organizations kind of understand how to consume this, how to use this, is really important for that.
One thing I wanted to add to that, I think, which I think Doc does really well, is like they're balancing like making it really easy to issue credentials with like avoiding locking people into using their system. And so what I love about them is that they've been able to make it really easy, but at the same time, there's the data portability, key portability built into it. So if you want to move, your keys and your data to another provider, you can do so, right? So I think that's also great for also from the enterprise perspective to be able to give that flexibility.
Just Alita was talking about the organization starting internally or with very small use cases. I think one of the key challenges here is to identify what Andrew Chen, who wrote the cold start problem, calls the atomic network. So almost all the networks that everyone's looking at eventually will be gigantic, exactly as Alina said. And even if it's just a national system, it's still gigantic, right? And it takes a long time. And in the meantime, there's a lot of challenges along the way. I think one of the challenges for anyone starting out is to feel comfortable in identifying the smallest self-sustaining network that creates real value. And for instance, in employment, sometimes it's 2 universities with 3 large employers in the same city. That's enough to create real value, both for the employers and their people that they're hiring, for the universities and their graduates that are coming out and looking for work. It's not ideal. It's not the whole ecosystem, but you want enough, a few organizations with the right credentials to start creating real value, and that will grow. Because then the network effect starts being created. Other employers want those graduates, so they want to implement too. Other universities see that large employers are hiring, they want to implement too. But finding what that smallest atomic network is, which will be self-sustaining and starts creating a network effect, is challenging. And what are the minimal use cases that we can focus on? Because this can be all-encompassing and it can be incredibly scary for everyone. Is really, I think, one of the things that we've been struggling with, but have found in different industries and in different geographies to be very different. And I think that's a tip, to look for that very carefully and make it even smaller than you think. So whatever you think is the smallest ecosystem, ask yourself what will happen if it was even a little smaller, even a little more achievable as something to start with.
I agree, Ethan, and maybe to jump in that, indeed, we are looking at the very big ones, but maybe we need to start small. On the other hand, what we also see in Europe is that some people are a bit hesitant to enter into that because they are expecting, no, we need to have semantic agreements on every standard, on every kind of credential. We saw that in education, they were struggling. I think Dominique was also aware how we struggled. Okay, let's define what is a diploma, what is this, what is a credential. So a lot of organizations are still wanting, okay, I want also semantic standards before I enter in those kind of things. Now, of course, this is very hard work and very much work, and sometimes it costs 10 years or 20 years before you agree even what those kind of things. I don't think that we'll be having the time to do all the things. If we have in focus to all those credentials. So maybe we need to also look at other kind of solution that can help us in the semantic translation. Because I think, Dominic, you also have experience in other sectors. I don't think that what we have done in social security and education, the pace that we are going in semantic, if you go in that road, we'll see in about 100 years before every credential is standardized. So maybe we need to have, I don't know if you experience other ways to do those kind of things.
Yeah, but
On the
maybe
non-standard approach, or yeah.
But maybe that's a curse of public sector ecosystems that are,
Yeah,
trying to
indeed,
build
maybe.
solutions or create a
Yeah,
foundation for any vertical.
yeah.
Because at the end of the day, what everybody here said
Mm,
is just
mm,
so true, right? If you're building an ecosystem, you're
mm,
building a three-sided, not a two-sided, a three-sided marketplace. And that's a
mm,
very, very hard thing to
mm,
do.
mm,
So you have to be very pragmatic
mm,
in terms of, what's the real pain and how can we overcome this? I
mm,
mean, Ethan made this great
mm,
example in the healthcare sector in the US, which is a great example to show how big a pain may have to
mm,
be to get more rapid adoption.
mm.
Because at the end of the day, we cannot just wait. I mean, we could, but we shouldn't just wait and rely on
Yeah.
regulations pushing the adoption of this, right? We know it's coming, right? And once the regulation here, the incentives
Mm,
are automatically coming with it, but we shouldn't wait for it. And if we're looking into the market and market dynamics that we're seeing, also with existing wallet infrastructure, I'm talking here mostly about payment wallets or crypto wallet infrastructure becoming
mm,
more open, right? To also include mobile driver's license, MDocs, and these kinds of let's say maybe a bit more traditional identity technologies than self-sovereign identity. We're looking into a future where very soon one of the biggest bottlenecks for for decentralized identity, namely wallets, could be unbottlenecked in a way very quickly. So who knows
mm,
what's happening? It's just very important that we're pushing from all sides, right? Pushing regulations forwards to make sure that we arrive at a, let's say, very fair marketplace or a very fair set of ecosystems for high level of assurance credentials, for core identity credentials, while at the same time building ecosystems potentially one vertical at a time to make sure that we reach the, let's say, critical mass so that, the whole digital world becomes just a mix of identity ecosystems that enable all kinds of interactions.
But how can we have confidence that this will all come together in the end? Because I definitely agree with you 100%. Like we cannot wait for the government to swoop in and gift us all a fully formed digital identity or anything like that. We certainly don't want to wait for one of the big tech monopolists to do that for us. So that whole like have faith, it'll happen. I totally agree. But of course, the risk with this sort of Cambrian explosion of lots of different use cases and starting with minimal viable ecosystems in lots of different places, is we today have real interoperability problems, not just semantic interoperability, as Daniel mentioned, but very practical technical interoperability, which is part of why Walt has built such a valuable product, because you guys abstract that and allow people to talk to multiple different flavors of credentials and protocols and things like that. So, is it just a case of we defer some of those decisions and we have this interoperability layer in the meantime to let us get some of those benefits, or are standards going to come in and help us? How can people think about investing today, in other words, with the confidence that this will still pay off further down the line, given how many uncertainties there are?
I would say we got to use tools such as what the folks from walt.id are building. We need these frameworks that are able to speak to more than one identity protocol, right? Things such as the ID kit that they have, things that such as what Veramo is doing, the other folks from Spruce ID. These multi-identity ecosystems, frameworks kind of hedge the risk of your identity protocol that you're implementing on top of becoming obsolete. But I don't know. Well, Dominic, maybe you want to.
No, 100%. I mean, that's what we are hearing a lot. When we're looking into what we're building, what we're always trying to do is not just show that being ecosystem agnostic is important, but actually work with different ecosystems to make it possible for people to utilize this. And at the end of the day, we heard this before. Adopters don't really care about the technology. I mean, in the conversation today, I'm not sure how often we use terms like self-sovereign identity or blockchain, but it hasn't been that often.
Yeah.
Simply because the conversations are really driven by the needs that you have. And so, looking into the market, looking what ecosystems are out there. If I'm an organization, and I have employees, then potentially things built by Velocity can be very, very useful because they're really zooming in on HR versus, if I have employees being located in the European Union or who may have studied in the European Union, then everything that EPSI is doing and the IDAS 2 is super important, right? So it's really just about making sure that we can give people very easy access to those ecosystems quickly and make sure that, as Otto said, we can hedge ourselves against the fact that not all ecosystems will survive, right? It will be the same in crypto and Web3, but some will, or many will. Maybe the most important ones haven't even been founded yet, right? That's often the case with new technologies. So let's just try to make every ecosystem we have easily accessible, and then make sure that people within the ecosystem do a great job in building it out.
Now, the only thing that's, I completely agree, Dominic, but the only thing that we don't need to do is what I've seen in the past years some startups do, that indeed build that ecosystem around a specific stack, around all those kind of things, and they build a rather close garden where you find everything. You find a wallet, you find ledgers, you find whatever you want, those kind of things, but it's always closed. Huh? So we need to see that, okay, you can build ecosystem, but you need to find a way to communicate. And that is something that is missing today. Maybe also in EPSI, we are missing that, how to say, okay, if we talk to a wallet, that is also can talk, translate certain things to another wallet, because I don't think it will be helpful. I think that one network or that one an ecosystem will rule. We need to interact with other networks, even Chinese networks or Asian networks will come in, people with credentials from those kind of things, and we need, of course, to protect them. So it will be, that's not a solution that we have today, but we need to do those kind of things. And also the business model needs to work with those kind of things, because some people have constructed that ecosystem around specific incentives, around a specific business model that only work in those kind of things. But what if I use a Polygon ID credentials and I use it in the EPSI context, it needs to work, and it also needs to work for your business model. If not, you say, okay, no, you can only use it in EPSI context and not in other, then we fail. But it's rather difficult how to achieve those kind of things. Huh?
Yeah. I mean, I think interoperability is so key, right? Because
Mm,
we're already going into this world where it's like
mm,
the standards words
mm,
of the electrical
mm,
plug, the European
mm,
format, the
mm,
US electrical plug,
mm,
the South
mm, mm,
American. And so like I feel like the wallets and the identity like toolkits
mm,
are sort of
mm,
like these universal adapters that allow you to
mm,
plug into any of these formats, right? So, but yeah,
mm,
it's
mm,
important to begin experimenting as
mm.
well. Like, you
Now,
got
of
to
course,
balance
there's
that out.
also a very big political dimension on that aspect, because you'll be having in different worlds, in different regions of the world, other kind of views on those kind of things. We are, of course, South American, European context, but you have other parts. Yeah, I don't know if every government in Europe will be comfortable to say, okay, we have a wallet solution, we add the credentials, another government can check and harvest those kind of things. So you will be having also closed garden on those kind of things and different views on how we deal with that. But of course, I think we believe that the citizens should be empowered, but I don't think that every region is in on that road at this moment. So we also need to face those kind of aspects.
But that's where the separation of
Mm, mm,
technology and governance stacks can really help, isn't it, Daniel?
mm,
Because you can
mm,
have
mm,
the
mm,
ability for things to be interoperable and portable at a technology
mm,
layer,
mm,
and you can
mm,
just choose to not bring the trust with it if you're operating outside of a given governance framework.
mm.
And so,
Indeed. Yeah. Mm.
maybe that's how we can get there. Although,
No, that's
perhaps
indeed
that's a
very
little
interesting,
idealistic.
because those kind of discussion can to get mixed. You have a
Mm.
government solution and they put on no, this is the best technology solution, and they limit it indeed to those kind of things. There's indeed a complete separate. I agree with you, James. That is a complete separate discussion. Huh?
Mm. Elena, it looked like you were going to chime in a minute ago. I want to make sure we hear from you as well.
Thanks. Yeah, Otto kind of touched on it, but I just think about how like interoperability and portability are so baked into kind of the promise of decentralized identity and ecosystems that in order for one to be successful, you kind of have to have the other. So I think even if we're starting with, scenarios where, we might be adopting standards in slightly different ways, we might have different, mechanisms of, how credentials get shared, and kind of all the, technical details are a little bit different, that might not be as interoperable as we would like it eventually to be. I think the fact that, it's, the ability to be able to share, to be able to kind of provide, these credentials in different aspects is key to making this whole thing a success. I think is a big driver for kind of ensuring that eventually, there will be adoption on these bigger scales.
And we're recording this, in August 2023. Do you think that today, despite what we've said about competing protocols and the risk of obsolescence, things like that, do you think we're close enough in terms of those standards and other aspects that you've mentioned for organizations to feel confident making an investment right now?
Yeah, I definitely do. I think I think there's always going to be standards that are evolving, and I think it's on us as technology providers to be able to help them bridge, those changes and to be able to, evolve as they do. But I think there's enough standards that have been adopted at this point that we can start building, we can start providing real value to organizations today, and it's at a good point, I think, as well, to get familiar with it, because there's, I think the basic building blocks are available. I think we're seeing enough adoption of these standards from organizations and governments, and all kinds of organizations, to really show that there is momentum behind it. So from my perspective, I do think that we're at a really good place right now for more and more adoption to happen.
I mean,
I
think
agree with you, Elena. Sorry, maybe to mention that. I agree with you, Elena, that the standards are there. But if I look, some organizations are still struggling because they see a lot of variation, and they are difficult to pick. Okay, what do I pick? Do I pick Polygon? I just mentioned that. Sorry, Polygon, or do I do EPSI, or do I do AI does? So there are a lot of variation. All options are good. Some are better than others, but okay. But they are a bit struggling. Okay, do I need to wait? And some organizations also take this position that, okay, let's wait till this is over and there is a network that rules them out. I think that's a wrong situation to do. You shouldn't wait. You can clearly imagine there are a lot of things that work. So pick one and go for it. If you wait until everything is solved, you can wait forever. So I think that's maybe sometimes I see a lot of conversation with organizations that are struggling with too many choice and too many things, and maybe that's something not a good thing.
No, please go first.
No, if I was to compare it to another point in time, it feels like we're almost like in the late 70s, where like the home video player is now finally getting there. Like the idea of a home video player is finally there. Maybe a few years ago the idea of the home video player was like not as obvious, but now we're there, and now there's like VHS, Betamax, a few other options, DITCOM, OpenID. Like there's the standards are emerging, and so like what Daniel and Lena are saying, yeah, it's sort of at that breaking point where you need to start experimenting. Otherwise, you're gonna get left behind and not value the learnings from these experiences. But maybe Dominic, you want to add more?
No, I mean, 100%. I just wanted to build on this. I mean, at the end of the day, being in this space for a while, I also think that this year is really the year where, when we look at the technologies that underpin this and the standards for these technologies, where they're really far enough to support production systems. And we're seeing this in our work, right? Where production systems are slowly starting to being rolled out in different industries. I still think that, the standards are not final. When are standards final? But which at the end of the day, they should just put a higher burden of work on, companies like many of our companies, just to make sure to build better abstraction layers, better developer tools. And to be quite honest, I mean, even if we say we get standardization completely right, new technologies will emerge that will be able to cover new use cases better. I think, Otto, you just mentioned OpenID Connect and DITCOM. I think that's a very, very good example that shows you that even if we get standardization right and we have a technology that is widely adopted, like OpenID Connect, which will probably be the dominating paradigm for data exchange and authentication protocols over the next couple of years, new protocols like DITCOM give you certain capabilities that OpenID cannot. And so they may become more important over time. And so I believe it's just a very dynamic way of handling different technologies and different standards that are also being, built out, extended all the time. And it should really be the job of companies building developer tooling to just hide all this complexity, to hide all this dynamic nature of technologies and standards in a way that developers can just use that ecosystem, maybe without even knowing which technology is behind it.
I think you're right, Dominic, and that's maybe the approach that we need to give the organization. You issue the credentials in the format that you believe in, and you do those things. And maybe the wallet is smart enough to handle people that have made other choices. So the Otto, you mentioned the Veta and VRX. The wallet should be able to do Betamax and VRS, whatever they do, of course. Okay, they are fundamentals, because if not, if we wait until everybody agrees, that lasts forever.
Part of why I think it's really important, it's a really good time for organizations to start adopting, is because it's really important for them to be able to also impact the direction of this technology. So we can sit here all day long and discuss standards, we can build amazing tooling, but if we don't have organizations starting to adopt this and give us really valuable feedback about what's important to them, what's important to their users, what trade-offs should we be making, because there's, this beautiful idealistic version of decentralized identity on one side, and then there's like the gritty real world adoption that's actually going to happen on the other side. And we really need organizations and that feedback to help really bridge the gap there. So I think that's another reason why it's really important for organizations to start getting involved, so that we can build it in ways where they really do benefit from it and can really drive adoption and get, all those benefits that we were talking about earlier.
Cool. And so before we move on, are there any other sort of critical ingredients that folks feel need to be present for an ecosystem to be able to take off? So we've talked about some level of technological capability, but also the interoperability side. We've talked about being aware of the regulatory context and the broader sort of governance landscape that you interoperate in, and crucially, we spent most of our time talking about being very clear who your stakeholders are and what the benefit is to them. And I'm happy that that's where the emphasis was. What else in the ecosystems that this group has seen see some success? What else do you think has contributed to that?
So I'd like to introduce something which for us has been really, really important, which was the role of proxies and notaries in this game. From at least, and others might take this into their different industries and different use cases and in maybe different ways. But at least in the employment world where we are, you have to get to a point at some point where every employer, every education institution, every training provider is issuing credentials. That's an incredible task, right? There are millions of those organizations. It's not realistic to expect every small employer with 3-4 employees and every training institution or coach, which may be one person, or a small, very small company to do that. And one of the things we identified very early is a critical role of both proxies. So proxies in our context, and everyone can take this to different use cases in different contexts, or for instance, the student information systems, HR tech systems, learning management systems that many employers use to manage that data. So instead of having to go to every university, every employer, every education institution, why not go to the systems of record that enable them? And if you look at our approach, most of our members and most of those organizations are the enablers for the actual issuers. And so that's one kind of proxy. And another is what we call notaries. So, you think about the world of work. If I'm in my 50s, which I am, some of the companies I worked with and some of the institutions I was trained by don't exist anymore. Well, there are already systems in the world of how to verify that information. There are bodies, background screening companies, notary issuers, and so on, whose business today is to investigate past information or information with organizations that are not digitally connected and verify that information is correct, right? So that world does exist in the physical identity world. But part of empowering such organizations into the digital self-sovereign world is to create additional organizations that are enabling the ecosystem to get going. And at least in Velocity, we found that actually at the stage we're at, major part of our current scaling is not with the primary issuers, the employers and the education institutions themselves, but actually with these proxies and notaries who are motivated for a little bit of a different reason to do this. But it actually can scale much faster and enable growth of a network in a much more effective way. So people listening to this will need to think about, in their context, what do those proxies and notaries look like? But we found that to be incredibly powerful to enable fast growth of the ecosystem.
Cool. Well, Ethan, I was going to say that, it sounds like being a decentralization maximalist is not the way to go. If I just sort of put an alternative spin on what you've just said, in other words, that may well be the destination where every individual ecosystem participant is fully equal in this network. But actually, there are some points of centralization that exist today for very good reason, and they can provide real value as a bridge to that future, right? And if we can do the things we talked about earlier, like align their incentives, for example, and make it very easy for them to plug into this new world, then it becomes a case of, hey, like jump in, the water's warm, as opposed to, oh, here's this terribly threatening thing that's coming to disrupt their business model. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Cool. Well, look, without being a downer here, we have touched on a few of the challenges that people might face. So there are clearly many benefits, and a lot of the starting points are here. But fear of the technical complexity has been one, and the sheer number of potential stakeholders has been another that I've heard. Are there any points before we wrap up that people want to make sure that our audience is aware of to be mindful for as they start assembling their ecosystem and thinking about getting things off the ground?
I mean, I think sort of the point that Ethan was making earlier about the minimum viable ecosystem. I mean, I wonder if we just came up with another acronym, right? We seem to love acronyms in Web3. So is it MVIE, minimum viable identity ecosystem? But I feel like identifying that minimal set of actors that will provide the full cycle, like the full SSI triangle, is key for your use case to be able to succeed, right? I think that's one thing. In the case of Polygon ID, we have like this ecosystem of Web3 like platforms that we're sort of kind of adding this identity layer on top of and encouraging the use case. But yeah, in another like Web2 ecosystem, you need to identify those players to make sure that your use case will be successful, I feel.
Yep. And Daniel, would you maybe want to comment on the pros and cons of sort of top down versus bottom up in that context as well, and kind of the risks of each of those approaches?
Yeah, that's indeed something challenging. And they say, okay, we can do this top down and arrange everything, and we go into the very European approach about having all standardized before we go in aspect. On the other hand, we see that there's also a slow take on, and sometimes you need that sprinkle to say, okay, a small ecosystem starts and then it can go wider. So I also believe that you need to go into specific ecosystem. The only problem is that sometimes it's complex, the world and the transaction. You cannot predict, okay, those people will interact mostly in those kind of little things. People have a very big ecosystem, very big network. Somebody work in the US maybe can go to Thailand to work, and then you expect all those kind of things. You cannot predict those kind of things. So that is sometimes difficult. But even if we spread out and the same initiatives can work, that is something that can be have an evolution. So.
Yeah, but in terms of the challenges, it's probably Daniel's expertise much more than mine. But our experience is, and I want to mention something around compliance and dealing with compliance. The compliant world was built for a historic world, and most of the different agencies and government organizations that are responsible for protecting aspects of compliance, whether it be privacy or in the US FCRA requirements for background screeners, or whether it's financial security like the SEC in the US and so on, were built on assumptions of the old world. One of our experiences, and this is where I'd like to encourage everyone, is not to be afraid to challenge those people. In many of those organizations, there are professionals who want to advance to a new world. The regulations were written for a different set of paradigms than a Web3 self-sovereign identity world. And it doesn't meet well, right? One of the things we've learned is it's not so scary to go to FCR, to go to the bodies that regulate FCRA in the United States and say, well, maybe, background screeners were aimed at, the regulations were aimed at protecting individuals. We do that in a different way. Let's review that. Or go to the Joint Commission, which in the U.S. protects individuals in the healthcare system, right, from nurses or doctors that aren't credentialed correctly, and say, well, your intent is to protect your end patients. Ours is as well. It's just a very different way. And I think the default of much of the regulation is to protect an old world. And my experience so far is, in many cases, you can challenge that with the right attitude, with the right communication, with the right education, and finding the right people within those organizations. It sounds very scary. I'm sure Daniel's dealing with that all the time in his world. But I can tell you that we deal with compliance in many places in the world and with many different industries. And in most cases, we manage through education and dialogue to find solutions that if we wouldn't even try to address, we would never have made the progress we've made.
It's a really good point, and actually even here in the UK, there's both the Financial Conduct Authority has a regulatory sandbox that has engaged in these topics, and there's a public consultation on the Digital Identity and Attributes Trust Framework, which is sort of how the government is thinking about providing a framework around these types of services. And yeah, in both of those cases, I think to the best extent a public sector worker can, they are really trying to be open-minded and have that two-way dialogue. And I'm sure you're right, Ethan. I'm sure that those stakeholders exist in the relevant industries and jurisdictions, and perhaps engaging early rather than coming across hostile and challenging is the way to go. So any other pitfalls that we want to make folks aware of before we wrap up? I mean, so far the story has been actually very, very optimistic and get started. But, Dom, I wanted to ask you in particular, just because the vantage point Walt has across all those different ecosystems, what if there was one thing you'd want to steer people off, perhaps in terms of classic mistakes not to make when starting your ecosystem, what might that be?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I'm not sure if it's obvious, but if you're an organization and you want to start to use decentralized identity, like issue credentials or verify data or offer wallets to someone, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to start your own ecosystem. So, what we're seeing is that we're working with organizations in, for example, I don't know, Asia Pacific, and there we have consortiums of banks that are really creating their own ecosystem, and it makes sense. But if you're an organization, going back to a concrete example in the employment space, then maybe it makes more sense to just get in touch with someone like Velocity Network, right? To just join the ecosystem and see if you can become a meaningful participator in this ecosystem. Because at the end of the day, people and organizations who are building these ecosystems, they have to be neutral. And it's something very different from, just implementing the technology to use decentralized identity. And so in terms of pitfall, maybe first question you should ask yourself, do I really need to invest the time into building my own identity ecosystem, or should I just join an existing one and, focus on the core of what I'm doing already? But sorry, I think you asked another question. I went a little bit off. Just get back to Ethan's point.
No, it was mainly what to avoid. And I think if I were to paraphrase your answer, it's avoid building an ecosystem for its own sake, right? I mean, I think that's the really distillation of what you've said. And it's a classic thing. Obviously, the topic today has been ecosystems, and I think why many of us get excited about portable or decentralized identity is, we want to be able to replace all those bits of paper, which are very versatile and very, very flexible in our real world lives, we want to be able to have all those same benefits digitally. And so that conjures up these examples like, oh, I want to take my degree certificate from some now defunct organization and still use it to apply for a job, or I want to use my driver's license to prove I'm old enough to buy crypto, or blah, 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 all these different things. We go naturally to those use cases because they are complicated and they're exciting and they require lots of stakeholders. But it does come back, I think, to this minimum viable ecosystem point, which was raised early and has come up throughout this discussion, which is that actually, in the beginning, perhaps you don't really need all that degree of openness and decentralization, interoperability. Maybe it's enough just to enable portability in your own bounded context. And if you do it by building on these open protocols and with governance in mind and these kinds of things, you have a path to that future as these other things mature around it, right? And if that's sort of my biggest takeaway from here is it sounds like we're saying actually this is the perfect time to start making those investments. Daniel,
Indeed,
go ahead.
and James, just to add to that, and the ecosystem also evolves. We also seen things, people that have started pilot, proof of concept, whatever they called it, but they have created an organization, a real conversation, and that helped them to evolve to the next thing. And they say, okay, the technical solution that we used was fine for the first thing, but then we evolved. But we are here as an ecosystem, as an organization that work together. I think it is the most important one, that collaboration to exist, whatever thing that you use, and we share the same values, and that is also important to keep in mind. And then you'll be having maybe more stable networks that can offer whatever you want to do, and then join them as a community.
No, very much so. So we're almost out of time here, which is unbelievable to me because this conversation has gone by so quickly and been really fascinating. But I do want to make sure that before we say goodbye, we have time for closing remarks. And so these people who have made it through this whole webinar will have an hour's worth of fascinating content. But if there was only one point that we could leave them with about ecosystems, I would really like to hear from each of you what that might be. So Elena, would you kick us off?
Sure. I would say that, I think this is absolutely coming. I think this is going to change how businesses operate. I think this is going to change how individuals make their way in the world, how they are able to share experiences and access services and all these different things. So I think, for organizations, whether you're just starting to think about it or maybe you're, piloting something, wherever you are in the process, I think expect that this is coming your way and start really thinking about how we can take advantage of this, participate in it. And, like we've been saying, start in a small way, but I do think this is going to be in our future fairly soon. So figuring out, what your strategy is now, really makes sense.
Otto, how about you?
Well, to go back to my VHS and Betamax analogy, I mean, I think the time is now to start experimenting with these things. Start producing content, start producing movies or tapes. Whether it's in VHS or Betamax. Don't wait for the DVD to come along. By then, it'll be too late, right? So, if anything, there'll be great learnings from being able to produce credentials and experiment with this, and being able to learn from that. So, the time is now. Pick a good partner. You can use walt.id, you can use Doc, you can use a variety of vendors and providers that can help you experiment. But the time is now to start experimenting, I think.
And Daniel, is that true in the European context as well, or should folks think about waiting until more of that infrastructure gets built
You
up?
need to take action. Indeed, we are now a bit in the complex world where things are changing in the hybrid world, but you need to take action. Organization will be, you'll be having, you don't want as an organization confront yourself with your users, say, okay, but you are difficult to interact with. I have my wallet and you can't speak with my wallet. I go to another bank. You need to be aware that those kind of situation will act. So you need to be before that. So Europe and all European organizations, we need to experiment. So I fully agree with Otto and Elena has mentioned. It's now the time to act. And what I also think of is something that I also reflect a lot about. We are now talking about a big revolution of digital identity for persons, but we'll be having a bigger evolution even more when we start to interact with things, we start to interact with products. that will be having also kind of identity. And the classical solution will even less work than we have with people. You will need to have those kind of credentials. So I think this is just the beginning. It will be transforming a lot to see how we interact with your car, with your whatever you want to do, call it, to do those kind of digital interaction. So it will be more and more important, the aspect. So definitely it is indeed the time to act, and organizations need to jump in it, experiment, learn, and be also flexible if things are changing, not to stick to one technology, and have, of course, many different actors with many different roles in that aspect.
Yeah, for sure. Gosh, Ethan, what thought would you like to leave us with?
So just building on exactly what Daniel ended with, that there are many different players and many different actors. An ecosystem is a very complex animal, sometimes frustrating. I often say that some managing or some of our ecosystems is like herding cats. I think it requires a lot of patience and understanding that different players in any ecosystem have different interests. I think the way to be successful is to understand what those different interests of different players in the same ecosystem without addressing the real pains and needs of different players. You're not going to be able to build a successful three-sided, as Dominique said earlier, ecosystem. And so it is a process. It is complex. It does require collaboration of multiple players, right? But it is worth it. The value that we're all going to be getting as these ecosystems grow and develop is incredible. But we need to address the complexities, the politics, the relationships, and the interests of the different players if we want to make it successful. And that requires slow facilitation and a lot of patience working with the different players to make it happen.
And being close to them, I think. I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is this is going to be hard for someone who's an outsider to do, right? Like it doesn't make sense if you have no innate context for the problem you're trying to solve. Is that, am I hearing you right? Like these things are best built by insiders in a way?
I don't know about by insiders, but definitely, I mean, I'm not an insider in many of the industries that I'm working in, but you do need to really, truly understand the issues and the incentives and the challenges and the problems, not from a technology helps, but from a real business, from a process business need perspective. This needs to have real value, and you need to articulate the value, understanding that in one ecosystem, you always, by definition, have players whose value is different, right? And so there's maybe conflict in what creates value and conflict in interest, and how to facilitate that process of finding the common infrastructure that will support and create value for different players in one ecosystem is challenging. It does require understanding, if going to ask to your question, James, understanding really who the players are and what they need. But it is possible. You just need to be very attentive and focused on making that happen.
And Dom, what final takeaways do you have for us?
Well, I think from this conversation, it's also quite clear that we're looking at a multi-ecosystem future. So if you're an organization and you're looking to adopt decentralized identity, issue data to your stakeholders, verify identity information, or launch identity wallets, you really want to be flexible, and you really want to make sure that your solutions are working with stakeholders regardless of where they are or in which industry they're operating in. So you really want to make sure that you have solutions that are future-proof, that support multiple ecosystems to get most out of the decentralized identity paradigm that we're facing.
Yeah, for sure. Wow. Well, gosh, I've learned a ton in this conversation, and I really can't thank the five of you enough for joining us today. So thank you. It's been amazing. And, one thing that's really clear is that, digital identity is complex. Digital identity ecosystems are even more complex. And this multi-ecosystem future that we're looking at is almost unfathomably so. But it's going to be underpinned by the great work on standards and on governance and on use cases and on business models that these fine folks and others out there in the community are working on. And so I find myself very excited and energized actually for what the future is going to look like in terms of these new capabilities that we're going to have to live more exciting, more engaging, and more trusted digital lives. So I will leave you all with that. Thanks again for your time, and looking forward to seeing you on another one of the Future of Identity series.